We're going to time travel back to 2015. That's when the craziness, as I currently call it, began. Maybe once I get this out of my system, I'll be able to find a more gentle word for it. This awakening story will cover all the bases and then some. So if you have suffered from any kind of trauma, you may find it and solutions here. I am a plethora of trauma and knowledge rolled into one for the purpose of karmic clearing, alchemical ascension, and my favorite, hermetic vibration. Now, I like to keep the message clean, so no graphic detail, no trauma bombing, no worries there. In light of the eclipse, we'll go ahead and dive right in. In 2015, I was working on trading pain pills for meth. I had been addicted to pain pills for over 3 years and desperately trying to find a way off of them without having to tell the world that I was an addict. I still didn't believe that I was an addict. I really didn't understand that concept as I do now. I was just addicted to a substance that I believed I could kick. And I did kick it. I kicked it with meth. Fall of 2015 rolls around as I'm making this exchange in my life, and along with it, some voices in my head. These ones were different than what I'd known previously in my mindscape. Technically, I didn't even know I heard voices until these ones came across, and they were in different tones that no longer matched a seamless transmission in or out of my mind. The proper term for this would be clairaudient communication, from my now understanding, and what I simply refer to as telepathy. Anyone that has experienced this before knows, though, that sometimes clairaudience can come across in other voices and in distinguishing voices outside of what you're used to, which I call the mindscape. I was paranoid on an 11-day riser with no sleep around the time they came across loud and clear, whispering to me that I was going to get drug tested. I lived with my mom at the time, and I was a horrible and toxic addict, so this made perfect sense. Later on, I heard the voices in my head again. This time, they came across as my mom and brother's voices about how high I was. I was in my bedroom at the time, and it sounded like they were directly outside my bedroom door in the hallway. However, when I opened the door, no one was there, and I came to find them downstairs, both in the living room. I'd like to say minding their own business, because if they had just had a conversation about me, I couldn't tell other than the voices I just heard in my head. I suffered greatly for the next month in the form of my disordered eating, trying to keep that I was on meth a secret, which I failed at miserably, by the way. You can't stay up for days or pick your face horribly without someone you live with noticing. My family had known things were wrong for a very long time. I just never saw anything wrong until these voices started participating in my life. The awareness or even self-care, it just wasn't there. I suffered in silence, as I did most of my life. The only things I was loud about was the abuse I had been through. And that happened in different occurrences and decades in my life, so there were different times about speaking it out. However, at this point, my subconscious was running over with it and didn't have the room for it any longer. It had started to seep out. And this is where the CPTSD truly started to develop. It wasn't rearing its ugly head yet, or I had no concept of it yet. All I knew were the voices coming to life. November or December that year, I got a hand-me-down car, and I was very grateful. I could finally go and do as I pleased. I had been relying on others in cabs for quite a few years. I also started venturing back to where I had moved from to frequent old friends and bars, which was where I ran into the abuser's cousin, who enlightened me on a dirty little secret I had kept quiet for all the years I was trapped in that relationship. In 2014, I moved across the state to escape pain pills, as well as, we're just going to call him the abuser. The abuser's girlfriend was spilling the beans of how he liked to go in between sexes, and I was extremely mortified. I was forced into the relationship with the abuser when I was 18 years old. And everything that I experienced with the abuser was traumatic, horrific, assaulting, and against my own will. However, when that type of situation happens, there's brainwashing. and other mental things that occur to help you stay alive and survive. And so keeping those secrets kept me safe and out of shame and out of embarrassment for the things that I was forced to experience, witness, do, know, even things like that. So I did what any other trauma-bonded drug addict would do at the time. I allowed my loyalty to myself and the shame and embarrassment I was able to keep at bay for over 10 years to manipulate me into putting myself back into harm's way. I made another trip back to that town that I moved away from to tell the abuser's mother the truth about him. However, I told myself that I was doing it to protect them and his daughter and sister, who I both helped raise them for quite a few years. The reality is, though, I was desperately trying to control the situation to save myself. Like I said, though, I put myself in harm's way. I walked right into the deadly cavern that I had worked so hard to get out of, and that was the day that my brain broke. I guess in retrospect, what occurred was my mind field was already down and easily enmeshable with others. I was still constantly hearing thoughts and messages from higher dimensional beings. I didn't always know this, though. I just thought part of me was going crazy, and of course, just like everything else I'd endured it in silence for as long as I possibly could. Plus, they were helping me, really, giving me heads up, right? Telling me I was going to get drug tested, different types of things. In lieu of my brain breaking, I started having out-of-body experiences. I even had a body swap at one point. I didn't know the language for this at the time, and it was absolutely terrifying. I had a few blackout moments that I had no clue even happened until months later when Spirit brought me full circle. At the beginning of this circle, though, was me inserting myself into a situation that flat out jeopardized my safety and my sanity. It's amazing what the mind can do when you've been out of abuse for a time period, and then what the mind did the moment I saw the abuser again. Let me be the first to tell you, if you have not already heard, your brain will not be able to heal while you remain in toxic situations. This is the fact that your brain, your entire body, is smarter than you. This is my truth. And what I've learned from spirit and mystic psychology, which I now specialize in, due to everything that I've been through over these past 9 years or so. Anyways, I'll proceed. The following week was a blur. I just remember being overwhelmed with anger at how things unfolded. The details aren't worth going into it at this time because they're just like any other toxic situation in a lot of ways. It was how my body, spiritually, mentally, emotionally, and etherically responded that made the differences. The week, a complete blur. However, when I came out of it, I was in a state of deep psychosis. There's a timeline of about 3 weeks in between before the next major event. Somewhere in this 3 weeks, I became under the impression that I was a snitch. Yes, I said it. I was under the impression that a physical act had occurred with a friendly DEA agent that took a liking to me and I was on a friendly basis with. Now, mind you, I lived under the drug code. I lived under the drug code before I ever did a drug, methodically planning out my own demise into addiction shortly after my dad died when I was just a decade old. The trauma that occurred from that, it just ran so deep, and then the events following it were even more traumatic. I latched onto the things my dad's family bragged about him, which weren't all good. One being that my dad was at one point, before I was born, a convicted drug dealer and a fighter. I latched onto that and decided that that would be the type of man I dated. Little did I know I was a self-fulfilling prophecy, literally at the age of 18. Snitching to me was a literal death sentence. And it was because my life had been threatened so many times on top of that if I ever went to the police about the abuse that I suffered as well. So those went hand in hand for me. Anyways, we'll get more to the backstory later because it does, again, everything comes full circle. Like everything else in the current timeline of this story. I believed I was a snitch and now in a complete full-on psychosis. When I say psychosis, I mean voices screaming at me from the moment I opened my eyes until I closed them at night. They were the voices of my abuser and his family, saying even further abusive things repeatedly over and over again. Thankfully, I was still on drugs and able to numb out. However, my whole life seemed to be flashing before my eyes. I started reviewing my whole life. It was like these spirits were bringing every memory of my life up, and I had to review them with them and go through them. I then, of course, given these circumstances and believing that I was a snitch and everything that had happened, I refused to go back to where the abuser was out of fear of him finding me and also just hating myself, even. The psychosis came from somewhere, and it also propelled me to stay in the vicinity of the county where I had moved to be safe. I had no reason to drive back and forth any longer and had little funds to do so. The job I had was at an unpopular bar at the time, and the pay was really cheap. I got in contact with an old using friend that I'll call Heidi in this story. All the names have been changed in this story. Heidi and I used together and worked together when I had first moved to the area. However, we had a falling out because that's what drugs and trauma do. However, Heidi had what I was looking for and so much more. I realized recently that I've been saying however a lot, and now I've said it again. So we're gonna address that later. Heidi wanted to introduce me to her friend Johnny. He was her connect, and apparently him and I were made for each other. Air quoting that. According to her. We'd both been put through the ringer by past relationships and supposedly had good hearts that continuously gave despite the damage that was done. I wasn't big into being hooked up. I was also in psychosis, thinking I was going crazy, trying to keep withdrawal at bay because I did slip up and have a few pain pills, and so now I was desperately trying to find them or meth, anything. After a few hours of waiting around, like anyone in active addiction or recovery can completely understand, Heidi and I made the drive over to Johnny's house. The house was super cute, really well kept, and I was impressed. Mind you, the psychosis is still going on in my head. That never stops. So anytime throughout this story you wonder what happened to the psychosis, it's still there, always there. Screaming at me, yelling at me. I break down every day. Sometimes I go a day or two maybe without breaking down. Eventually it's just abuse. It's constant abuse, and very hard to live with at the time. So again, after a few hours of waiting, we go to Johnny's, and I meet him. I honestly didn't know what to think of him. He kind of scared me a little bit, and he was older than what I had dated before, which no big deal. I had a age limit. I would not date anybody that was over 10 years older than me. This is because my parents had been 26 years apart, and nothing against them. They were together for like 8 years. However, I just felt like being within a decade was a little bit more relatable and better for like longevity in a healthy relationship. So, where am I at? I have notes that I'm trying to follow, so just don't mind me, because otherwise I'll go way off and I'll end up down every single rabbit hole that happened during psychosis and during this entire adventure, and there's a lot. And so, maybe book one day, who knows? Not trying to get ahead of myself. I'm just trying to stay on task for what Spirit has called through me to move forward and put out there in unconditional love. This is what that is. This is a message of unconditional love to myself, loving myself no matter what I have done or went through or anything like that. So let me find myself on my notes here. Just bear with me. There it is. Okay. So yeah, met with Johnny, got high. I also mentioned that his place was real nice. I was used to growing up, like not growing up. I grew up in a very nice town, very nice home. We didn't have a lot of money. In certain eras, we went through a lot of different like changes that changed our lifestyles a lot. However, once I was 18, I ended up in what we would call the ghetto, where in the county there that I had lived at that time. So seeing a quote unquote drug dealer is what I would call Johnny just in this moment. That's all. He owned a house. It was really nice. It was nothing too fancy, nothing big. It was, rednecky. because, I live in West Virginia. I'll just go ahead and, give that out. I don't need to hide that from anybody. So anyways, so yes, that's why that came up. So I'd never been good at like being hooked up with people, especially since the first person I was ever hooked up with through like other people was the abuser. And so I'm sure I had a lot of resistance to being hooked up. However, I needed the drugs at the time. And so Johnny really intimidated me. So I didn't know what to think of him. He was older than me and I didn't expect that. I also wasn't committed to jumping in the sack with him. I never was. I've had my moments, there's no doubt. However, I was very good at buying and supplying drugs for myself. My body was a gift, and while I didn't treat it as one or look at it as one, I still had an understanding about sex. I'd also been forced to give it to someone for so many years that I'm sure that framed me in this way moving forward. Lots of trauma around that. Johnny, on the other hand, liked loose and fast, and that's what he was looking for. I was not it. Quick circumstances arose to where Heidi and her boyfriend needed a new place to live, and Johnny allowed them to move into his house for the time being. Heidi figured I should move in with them too, since Johnny needed a partner and I hated staying at my mom's house. Needless to say, I didn't really get a choice in the matter. After just like 1 or 2 days, my car blew up on the interstate and Heidi didn't have one. The only person that I knew that could tow and come get me quickly was Johnny, and he did. I had moved counties, like I had mentioned, a couple of years prior to in 2014, and all this was at the beginning of 2016 now. We're in January of 2016. And so I still didn't like know people like I did from the county I moved from, because I lived in that county since I was 15. So drugs were harder for me to find. Friendships were harder for me to make. I didn't have just this a plethora or abundance of people that I just knew over, 10 years or so. Little over, yeah, it was over 10 years anyways. Okay. So there was a part of me that never wanted to go back to my mom's again. With no car and no way to get high as easily, I had found this freedom over the past like 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks, say past month that I had a car, and now it was gone. And I didn't want to lose that freedom. So I agreed to stay at Johnny's, and I, would sleep on the couch. Psychosis, still reeling. And meth is a hell of a drug, so I'm sure everyone knows sleep was for the weak back then. I'm just kidding. I couldn't sleep half the time if I wanted to. The anxiety, the psychosis, I was terrified. I was going crazy. I didn't know what to make sense of it. So, I'll bring the elephant back into the room if any of you have forgotten. I thought I'd snitched, and Heidi was the killer stabber type, living by the code as well. I wasn't violent like she was. However, the secret was poisoning me. I know it made the psychosis worse as well. So to clarify, mid-January, I moved in with Johnny and spent most of my time working on how to not be a dope whore and keep my body to myself, which I did just fine, secluded in Psychosis, getting high, and just journaling about my life in the basement while I hotboxed cigarettes. However, I wasn't very useful, right? Like, I was there living off of a man for free, and he was very kind about it. However, I'm very annoyed towards one point. So in all of that time frame, the first sexual assault memory returned from when I was 18, and I started sharing it with Heidi. And while she cared, a little bit, her goal was for me to be with Johnny. And so not the healthiest environment to have psychosis and CPTSD just immediately start rearing their ugly heads. So what happened next, I'll kind of fast forward to. Heidi and I started going on runs with Johnny, and I had no clue when I met him just how big he was getting. Here I was believing I had snitched on someone, and the universe just landed me in the home of a prosperous drug addict. There's a difference between a drug dealer and a prosperous drug addict. And anybody that might hear this sentence may want to sit with that if they've ever been in that environment. And that's why I said earlier, just in that moment, I was going to call him a drug dealer because I knew I was getting to this. Anyways, I was fucked. I was terrified. Not for them, for me, because I hated myself and what I had done. I was also prepared and believed that I should die for what I had done. And then the bullshit happened. You see, up until this point, Heidi was really the only one I talked to. I wouldn't look anyone in the eye when I spoke to them. I wouldn't speak my needs or that I was hungry. I was literally a mouse that tried to make myself as invisible as possible. I felt like nothing but an awkward burden, hearing voices in my mind every single day and just trying to pretend like everything was okay. So the point here is to get whatever so politely screwed me into living. Johnny and I in the car alone together one day, and he made a comment about looking people in the eyes when you talk to them. I intuitively knew he was referring to me, and even though I was in this distress, I don't back down from a challenge. I am an Aries. And I don't know if that has to do with it. It might also have to do that the goddess Eris is right there in my chart as well as Aries, and I'm just so close to both. And I am definitely a warrior. There is absolutely no doubt about it. So I took it as a challenge, and I accepted the challenge. And I looked him directly in his eyes. And I lost my spot on my notes again, which is dun dun dun, drum roll please. I looked into his eyes, and for the first time, my vision went into his eyes, to the back of his head, down a long tunnel, which I now refer to as the chakra cord, and down into what I also call now his root chakra, where there sat a lake-like pool of water. And in that water was him. It was his face staring up at me, yet it was my face staring up at me. And therefore, I saw that we were one in the same, and that he was me and I was him. My vision then retracted back out of the tunnel, back through his head, out of his eyes, and back into my own eyes. Go gadget eyes, right? From that point on, everything changed within me. I started to care more about myself and the psychosis, however. I did believe it was in the name of love, because now I was completely in love with Johnny, something I could never give myself before. You know, the irony, right? Can give everybody else love, or think I can give everybody else love, but can't give it to myself. That's addiction. And sometimes that's just the societal programming as well. I'm going to speed this part up. I couldn't deny that Johnny was doing, or I couldn't deny what Johnny was doing, and also couldn't lie to Johnny. I was in love with him now. He had to know the truth. You know, I had to suffer. I had to do that. I began hinting and ever so slightly confiding in him. I even planned all the ways that him and his buddies could kill me so that they would know they were safe. One of them was part of a prison gang, and therefore I felt if worse came to worse, I could rely on him to take me out. In my head, I planned they could just OD me and no one would ever question the difference. I wasn't a needle user, however. Drugs can take you to some really dark places. So I basically told him that I had a acquaintance slash somewhat friend that was a DEA agent, and that he should probably scrub my phone. And that, you know, obviously created problems with Heidi and myself. I was freaking everyone out. All I was trying to do at the time was be honest and then kill myself so they all knew they were safe and that I would never snitch. You know, this is the thought process in psychosis and back then. You know, it's not, oh, you can just leave. I didn't have anywhere to go and I was too afraid of leaving, right? There was a lot of shame. I'd never been homeless before. So I think part of it was like killing was my escape from that as well. So all of this ramped up the psychosis even more. I started having visions and transmissions of how the philosophy and belief system around snitches get stitches and going down for another person was in fact one of the spiritual meanings of the devil coming to life. In all of my psychosis, in all of my spiritual learnings, and all of the transmissions I've ever received, this is the only time that they have actually used the term devil and brought, like, it's just really interesting to me because I've learned so many concepts. Like we talk about, like in Christianity, they talk about the devil and, you know, this is the only time, I will stress that, this is the only time that they have ever said the devil is real in a concept. And it is in this concept. It is not in necessarily that concept. And I think that it's real in this concept because addiction is hell. Like that is truly what it is. And that is where the devil lives. And the devil has control of you. And when you give anyone control of your life, to say that you can't be 100% honest when asked for a truthful statement, it's by no means trying to say that you can pawn your responsibility off on someone else. Instead, this transmission was saying taking your responsibility. However, taking the responsibility for your dealer was them literally being the devil in the ether and ruling over your own personal and private hell. It was so clear in the transmission. It was actually very, very beautiful. And it released me from ever having that mentality. Like the 20 some years, however long it was, that I lived in that code. It didn't matter if I had snitched or not at that point. I saw that I was allowing people to trap me in hell, and I was giving people the power. It's not that nobody was trapping me. I was giving people the power to put me in hell, and I was giving my power away. Again, take responsibility for your shit. Don't take responsibility for somebody else's shit. That was like really the biggest lesson from that transmission. So I saw it clearly, beautiful transmission. A download that finally freed me from a belief system that constructed my life and never actually kept me safe. Instead, it kept me in the throes of others' controls. Along with the psychosis and downloadable transmissions, I could also hear their thoughts from miles away, people's thoughts. I remember Johnny being at a neighbor's house over a football field length away, and I could hear their convo as if they were right there by me. I even went down to the basement to look for them because I could hear them so closely. So the distance got wider. Like at first I thought it was my mom and my brother right outside my bedroom door when really they were downstairs. Then it was Johnny and neighbors down the road. And then eventually it was, I can hear anybody now. And because the distances got longer and longer and farther and farther. And it was super, super interesting to be able to see that. I can look in retrospect back at that, and that's neat. Along with the psychosis and downloadable transmissions, I was about to repeat myself. That first transmission that I received about the devil being in the drug dealer and the, snitches get stitches, it didn't matter to me though when it came to my mission of wanting to die, because nobody else was going to understand that concept. I didn't have like the word, like it was described so beautifully to me. However, it was very hard. Everybody knows it can be really hard to put into words what you download and the transmissions that you receive. And I didn't even know that that's what I was getting at the time. I knew that it was true. I knew that it was fitting for me. However, I knew that it didn't matter to anybody else. So if it didn't matter to anybody else, it didn't matter to me. Because I had to base my belief system on everybody else's and the situation that I was in for my safety. They still remained in a lower vibrational understanding of a capitalistic and patriarchal creation, because that's what that whole philosophy is, right? Like the government created that and they live by that and they turn everybody against each other and so on and so forth, which is a whole nother download later on. We might not get to it right now though. Then the next transmission came that the individual that I had snitched on or believed I'd snitched on was actually a snitch themselves. Again, I knew it was true. I saw all the parallels and was given the information that I could not dispute. My mind, though, I demanded papers because everybody knows normally, you gotta get a snitch on papers. Since there were no public papers of this evidence that I knew of, I could not use that excuse as a reason to live or prove my innocence. Plus, I didn't know this at the time beforehand, so how could I actually use it? What I'm saying is like, I didn't know that this individual was a snitch before I had done what I thought I'd done. I was given these two major transmissions because it finally came down to me sitting in the gang member's truck one night, waiting my fate, and I could tell they weren't going to punish me the way I thought I deserved. So since they weren't going to punish me at all, they were just going to kick me out. I may have been more scared of that being my punishment though than death, which I had already mentioned, because I had never been completely homeless before with no one, and that's also what I was facing. And I also just couldn't imagine going on using drugs and being in the drug life, knowing that I had done that. Like, I broke the ultimate code, right? And even though I was learning all these things at that time, I didn't understand how I could go on. And as I sat in that truck writing a letter of goodbye to my siblings, I decided that when that letter was done, I was going to walk to the highway and complete my mission. No graphic details here. The highway was just a mile up the road. I was at peace with it. However, the voices and the psychosis and everything else was not. And the songs on the radio were not. They were country songs, screaming lyrics at me. However, I refused to listen. Then out of nowhere, the gang member demanded I came back inside. He ripped open the truck door, scared the shit out of me. So obviously I did what he said. And I was pissed also because he was not supposed to interrupt me. He was supposed to leave me out there, and I was supposed to be able to walk to my fate, what I thought was my fate. Johnny wasn't home, so he was nowhere to be found during this time period. It was the gang member Heidi and her new boyfriend. As soon as I walked in the house, the gang member forcefully grabbed me and submitted me to the ground. It didn't take much. I'm 5'3", and he's like 6'5", something like that, maybe more. So I was like a rag doll. And I didn't fight it. I didn't, lost the will to live, right? I lost the will to live a long, long time ago. However, I thought I was finally getting what I wanted. The end of this real life scenario was my suicide attempt was stopped by the gang member when he submitted me and zip tied me with my hands behind my back and laid me face down. I remember still being ready to die. However, all I got was a warning never to come back around, and I was left there on display for a while. Johnny arrived sometime shortly after and came in and picked me up and cut the ties off of me and asked me if I was okay. I was fine, numb, and then taken to a hotel where Johnny paid for 3 weeks altogether for me to stay. And it's different hotels, and I barely had any contact with them during the time. However, he made sure that I was fed. And when people would bring me food or he'd bring me money, I would also obviously get high. My cell phone was broken, so all I had to rely on was the hotel room phone. Life got exponentially shittier as the psychosis bore into my soul. Every song I heard on the radio had its own message. Every commercial. I remember Take Out the Trash Tuesday on the radio and thinking I was the trash and I just been taken out. It was devastating, and I was pitiful and absolutely helpless. All I wanted was Johnny's attention and for him to see what we were. However, I knew what I had done, and that was that. Because the psychosis and spirit didn't like that I regularly practiced an eating disorder and was binge drinking again on top of it, they amped up. I remember so many nights lying in the hotel room feeling like laughing gas had come over me and then absorbed by different memories of my past. This is also where I found out that the telepathy had no limitations on distance. And, I heard all of their voices, every single one from the house that night, pouring into my mind. It was like they were there was no room above me at the motel. And it was like they were in that room. It was like they were in the attic. So there was no room above me, but it was like they were in the attic. Sorry. And all it was just snitch, 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 screaming at me over and over again, day and night. And then you had the abusers' voices. And then you had this overwhelming psychosis come over me of that I was fucking pregnant. And then again, all of the memories of my life coming up. I was going nuts, right? I don't think anybody would have known, though. I think all anybody would have known was maybe that I was on meth and high and homeless and, struggling. Nobody knew what was going on in my head. So, like I said, I suffered in silence for a long time. Psychosis decided that it would best serve me to convince me I was pregnant. The logical part of me that knew I could never have children because I had endometriosis and polycystic ovarian syndrome and a large amount of surgeries was just completely snubbed and locked in a closet for a couple of weeks. So here I am going crazy and believing I'm pregnant. I go take 4 pregnancy tests, 2 blood and 2 over the counter. I finally called Johnny, who was not very kind at this point because that was the last thing that he wanted was a child. And I didn't blame him, and I didn't realize it was, I thought it would be a miracle. So I would have kept it. However, now in retrospect, I wouldn't have been a healthy mom by any means, shape, or form. So it was a blessing that I definitely wasn't pregnant. However, I took my fifth and final drug test with Johnny, and that's like when the psychosis kind of lifted on that aspect. And I know that that's because Johnny was my twin flame, or is my twin flame. There's no was, is. And so like there was like a truth that was allowed to come out when I was able to do that. I also had other circumstances that pointed to like the psychosis couldn't hold up any longer. My physiology was taking over. So the one thing that I did stop though during practicing the eating disorder was the bulimia. I wouldn't put a child through that. I also was actually trying not to use drugs and not drink. There was a time period that I spent 4 nights, my first 4 nights on the street. I have 2 dads in my life, one that's passed and one that's alive. So my dad that's still here paid for a hotel for a couple of days. It was right around my birthday, so it worked out well. And the psychosis was driving me insane, right? Like I just told you all about everything that was happening in my mind. And so I'm in this hotel room that my dad is now paying for, because this is 3 weeks after the 3 weeks and after a couple of days of being homeless. And in my brain, things were happening. There were all kinds of sensations, filing cabinets closing, sharp pinches, like felt like little worms moving around, weird sparkly sensations, all different kinds. I was in and out all the time. I was just in that hotel room fucking crying. And then I would go and I wouldn't even leave the room. I would order room service because it was a really nice hotel. Homeless life, right? No, I'm just kidding. It was the only one within walking distance. So my dad went ahead and paid for that one. And so anyways, the rest of them were nothing like that. And, I was able to eat, and I just stayed in that room. I was afraid to leave the room. I didn't know what to do. I was terrified. And I hadn't taken the 5th pregnancy test at this point. It was after I left this hotel that I took the 5th pregnancy test. So I was like crying to my biological father in the hotel room that had passed, because there was a time period in my life where I made a solemn vow that I would only pray to my biological dad. The concept of God, I went to war with. God, I went to war with. Whatever. Like, I was pissed that my dad was taken from me at a young age, and the trauma that ensued from that, which is a whole nother thing. So I would only pray to my dad. So I was like asking my dad, like, just fucking take me. Like, please, why won't you just take me? Like, this is horrific. I don't want to be here. Take me to heaven. And, I got teary-eyed thinking about it. Just like that, though, like literally just like that, after hours and days of all of this, it just stopped. And there was just this very loud and clear statement. It's telepathy. And I just collapsed down the side of the bed onto the floor. And it's kind of comical because it was just like, I was just like, oh, okay. That makes so much fucking sense. And it did. Like, as soon as I heard it's telepathy, I understood it. And I was like, okay. Now, it didn't make it go away. I will give you that. It did not make it go away. It did, however, take away all the possibilities of schizophrenia and multiple personality disorder and DID and all of whatever I was trying to figure out what it was on a psychological diagnosis level. And it was none of that, thankfully. So schizophrenia was still up for debate, though, that's for sure. And that's what all the therapists through the years said as well. However, never got that diagnosis. So it was a spiritual psychosis with a lot of schizophrenic tendencies and a lot of shit. So yeah, from that point on, I just started talking back and started having conversations with them. Psychosis didn't go away. The voices didn't go away. Every day I was still regularly abused in my head by voices, especially voices of the abuser and his family, which now that I knew about telepathy put a whole new fear in me. Like I felt sane. However, it was terrifying that I was hearing their voices, because it's like, if I have telepathy, then that means that they have telepathy, and that means that they can, they have a tie to me. When I divorced my abuser, the abuser, when I have divorced the abuser, the judge looked at me and was going to give me everything I ever, like anything I wanted. And all I wanted was my last name back. And I wanted absolutely no ties to him. I just had this deep understanding of, I didn't want anything that could ever possibly tie me to him. No excuses for him, no money to pay me, nothing. Because, I was terrified. And I didn't want anything. That was it. So the ties were ethereal now in my head, right? Like, oh my God, this is exactly what I was terrified of. This is why I didn't ask for anything in the divorce. This was my worst fucking nightmare come true, was that the abuser had telepathic ties to me and I was never going to be free. So I lived with that fear for, like, I lived for that. So all of this was probably March, April of 2016, and I lived with that fear until maybe March or April of 2017. Probably a full year, a full cycle. Might have been a little sooner than that. Anyways, that's for a later date. Every day still was the psychosis of abuse and the telepathic transmissions. Now they had begun to teach me ancient knowledge, though, about telepathy, staying on our soul's path, the process of elimination concept from a higher perspective, and karmic resolution, as they are so kindly asking me to call it here. Yes, I am still in constant contact to this day. The main thing that's different between now and then is I control the psychosis. Well, yeah, I control the psychosis. I was going to say in a sense, but I control the psychosis. Thanks, third eye. I can feel you all around right now. I know the psychosis' purpose, so if it gets loud, I understand why, and I can pivot to put it back in Pandora's box and no longer be a burden to me or drive me fucking crazy. Back to this past point in time, though. I was in a shelter and immediately got a job in the service industry once, I was able to pass a drug test. I lasted 2 weeks before I got kicked out of the shelter for drinking, and my mom allowed me to sleep in her garage. I was fully employed, and I was working to get an apartment. She took me to and from work or dropped me off in town somewhere until work, and then I would catch a ride or a cab back. This lasted just a couple more weeks before I got into my own townhouse down the road from the restaurant I worked. Still, everything blaring, except for now we were friendly. I still lived in the fear, though, and they wouldn't necessarily talk about, like, that aspect. Everything was divinely conducted, I guess. I've been drug-free for over a month and still enduring abusive psychosis, as well as learning from the other voices. My goal was to get myself together and reach back out to Johnny. I hadn't forgotten about Johnny. I was doing great and had accomplished everything on my own and feeling really good. It didn't bother me to go without drugs. However, I didn't mind using them once they were in front of me again, and I had the funds to pay for them now. So right back into the cycle I went. The only thing I didn't have was the car. My guides weren't really happy, and they expressed that through my tips. Also, there was a lot of chaos that occurred there with Johnny, and Heidi ended up moving in with me, and it was a fucking mess. They had a falling out. Everybody had a falling out. One of the goals I had, which was a crazy goal, was, I was going to redeem myself as a snitch, and get back into the drug community and get back into the drug environment. And needless to say, I did that, just so everybody's very clear, because the reality of it is everybody has a reason that they would snitch, was just another download that I received, and there's a lot more to it as we proceed. So just stay tuned for that. So it really didn't matter to me that I did or didn't. However, it did come full circle that I did. However, I also didn't. So fun little paradox for you guys there. I did speak to the DEA agent, and because we had, like, he would invite me on his boat, like all that kind of stuff. Like, and he knew that I used, and he, you know, people have their own secrets, their dirty little secrets, whatever. And so, and I don't even remember this guy's name anymore, because it was just such a short stint. Oh my gosh, I couldn't even remember it, even if I tried. Anyways, so, yeah, so I did, but I didn't. So it came full circle and it freed me from it. So it was like, fuck yeah. And I was able to move on with my life. However, in the eyes of anybody looking at it, I did. That's what we're going to say, and that's what we're going to go with, and I'm perfectly fine with it because ain't no devil going to control me. And I sure as hell am not giving anybody power over me. Not ever again. I'm working on reducing the power I've given out, you know, getting all those pieces back of me, even still to this day, 9 years later. My tips. I worked as a server. I was in the service industry. My tips were just, I remember one night, 5 tables in a row stiffed me. And there was nothing wrong with their food or anything like that. However, this was spirit coming in and taking my money because I wasn't doing what they wanted me to do. I wasn't staying on my soul path. I wasn't, and I can't say that I wasn't. It was just, this was part of the teachings, of the learnings. And it was very miserable. It made me feel very powerless, and out of control. And there was a lot of other things that were going on physically with my body, health-wise. So I was very stubborn though. And I was very used to trying to force what I wanted out of life if I could get it. And so I was definitely prepared to fight. Needless to say, I lost. Don't ever go to war with spirit. I don't know if I've said that yet, but it's somewhere in here. After about 6 months, I ended up homeless again, 2 months late on rent and having to return or sell all of my rent-owned furniture. There were some experiences during this time period, however. The only ones that are of the utmost value at this point are that while I was sober and getting on my feet, I started having premonitions. So I was also... Let me stick to this notes right here so I don't go off. I was also visited by an oracle numerous times, or the oracle never left. I don't think the oracle's ever left because I'm an oracle now. I read hermetic vibration and I read hermetic prophecy, and I speak it. And I think that this was activated through this portal. So I was visited by an oracle that stayed with me for quite a while, probably through the entire psychosis. The oracle was partially probably the psychosis as well. However, this was very clear. And the premonitions were of the prophecy of my life and the foretelling of things to come. So there was premonitions that I was in that were like real time playing out, that I was, you know, living in my mind's eye. And then there was a story that the oracle was telling me. And so the premonitions were of certain points along the line of the prophecy, and every premonition came true. And the story, though, that the oracle was foretelling of my life at that time was that Johnny and I were meant to be together. We were 2 matchings of a soul that could help heal and harmonize the earth. Heidi and the abuser, back where I moved from, loved drugs and violence. Heidi and the abuser somehow knew that I was in love with Johnny. I mean, Heidi knew, the abuser didn't, so the abuser also somehow knew. The plan then unfolded further. The abuser wanted me back and would do anything to control me, as well as control the drug game and money. Heidi would do anything to be rich in drugs and money and never have to do anything again. Heidi and the abuser plot to sabotage Johnny and get him arrested and thrown in jail and take over as the prosperous drug addict, because that's all any of us were at this point. We're drug addicts. They would then have the means and the connections to take Johnny's place and everything he had. Then we would see if I still loved Johnny when he had nothing, which I knew I would because I didn't care about the drugs or the money. Towards the end of my using, I was actually using just to be in touch with Johnny. Otherwise, I wanted to stop using. The souls had spoken, and I knew that Johnny and I were soulmates, or at least I thought that at first. But remember, I've already used the term that I now know, and I remembered the concept of twin flames had been following me for the past few years since I'd escaped the abuser. Bingo. Johnny was and is my twin flame. My soulmates were all the souls that led me to Johnny. Back to the Oracle though. With this Oracle came a ton of premonitions again. They played out like first person movie reels, and I could see people in places so vividly. It was really amazing to see. I was not impressed with the Oracle's story though, and vowed to disrupt it and save Johnny from Heidi and the abuser. The premonitions, when I do have them today, they still come true. I don't have them as vivid as I did in the Psychosis, or at least not in like first person movie reel. Like these would be like long movie reels. Like when they played out in real time, they were like, it's like a 30-minute scene where I'm just like frozen, realizing that I had a premonition about it, and that I was now living it out and would get scared. So the spirits then also vowed that I would not remember all of the premonitions or the oracle until the time came, so as not to dwell on them and have the prophecy completely destroy the path that I was on. I would only remember certain fragments, like that Heidi and Johnny were supposed to end up getting together at some point. I did everything I could to hold on to them, though, including writing them. And this was that time period that Heidi was living with me, and these writings magically were detained and discarded of by the universe in its own creative ways. And it's not saying Heidi did it. There were numerous people that could have done it, and numerous people that had the wantingness to is a good way to put it. So they, I had already mentioned that they brought me full circle on the snitch thing. I do like this part though. I was broken from the spell and able to claim my life as mine once again. For me, it didn't just fall into the drug category, you don't snitch, it was every category. Therefore, I would never admit or tell that I was abused and beaten or sexually assaulted. The light had shined through my rose-colored glasses, and the illusion was ripped off and thrown into the bright blue. And when I say that, like, remember how I said, like, the no snitching didn't just go for the drug code, it went for, like, all the abuse that I had suffered. And so that also freed me. So during this time period, I was also sorting through the trauma of the abuser that I suffered for close to 10 years. I was taking my own inventory, understanding myself better than I ever had. And then I got to that part. I didn't have an excuse or an understanding, and I told the voices that. I must have just... So what I'm saying here, I'm reading from the notes a little bit, and I feel like I'm getting a little... Like, nobody's going to understand what I'm saying. Again, going through my life, period by period, by period, by period, by period, memory by memory by memory. And came the question of, like, why did I love the abuser? Like, why was I with the abuser for so long? And I didn't have an answer. Okay? I just thought that he assaulted me. So, backstory, the abuser and I dated for 4 months. We dated for 2 months. I broke up with him for cheating on me. And then I took him back because I wanted to get out of my household because my mom and I were extremely toxic. It was a very volatile household. I had just come home from a group home, and life was so much better at the group home. But because I turned 18, the state had to kick me out. So anyways, I took the abuser back so that way I would have another place to go. And then 2 months after that, he sexually assaulted me by way of sodomization. And so I thought that I had just, like, somehow, like, I just chose to stay with someone that did that to me and that, you know, abused me for years, because I remembered that I was abused every day. I didn't remember all of the heinous abuse and certain things that happened. And so I had, you know, was getting very honest with myself and was like, well, I just must have loved somebody that didn't care about me. I must have, that just must have been the type of person I was. I didn't understand it. I was trying to understand it. And so I was, you know, speaking to spirit and just being like, I must have just loved someone that treated me like shit. I couldn't explain it. I couldn't understand it. I was looking for answers myself. However, it was just, that was the simplest answer that I could come up with. It was the most honest answer I could come up with. Then spirit revealed to me that I'd been in Stockholm Syndrome all those years. And while I had an idea of what Stockholm Syndrome was, and it sounded appropriate, it, like, it settled into my soul as, oh, okay, that makes sense. I, of course, researched it. And with it came back one of those other memories. And that was the memory that put me into Stockholm Syndrome. I remembered, I remember the day the abuser violated my life and free will with a firearm and forced me to make a decision between being in a relationship with him from that point on, or finding out if he was actually going to kill me and myself, or kill me and himself, or my friends and family. And this was after he sexually assaulted me for the first time. He wanted to force forgiveness out of me. And to force forgiveness out of me didn't just mean that I could forgive and go on because I had left him after that assault. It was that I had to be back with him and be back in his control. And with that, I don't have in my notes, but it's coming to mind, so I might as well mention it here. With that came the, what I like to refer to as the mystic psychology. So it was the underlying subconscious storyline that was feeding the acts and what became conscious, right? Because we all know that what is buried in our subconscious becomes conscious, and it doesn't always make sense, right? Like, we don't always know what's in our subconscious. So what fed the abuser was that I was a daddy's girl, and my dad left me an inheritance when he passed away. And my dad protected me, and he loved me, and he was a very good man to me. And my dad had his faults. There is no doubt about it. Like I said, prison for coke. You know, my dad was definitely an adult child and an alcoholic and a gambling addict and all of these things. He burnt down our house to claim the insurance money, for heaven's sake. And, you know, so yeah, but my dad loved me and he protected me and he gave me everything I ever wanted, and I was very spoiled. And he was my best friend, and we were very much enmeshed and definitely trauma bonded from the younger years when my mom left him, which she had every right to do, because not just the age difference, but the fact that, you know, when she got pregnant with me, she grew up and it changed everything. And my dad didn't necessarily, unfortunately. My dad did grow up somewhat. However, it wasn't enough. And that's okay, because my parents didn't need to be together. I wouldn't have my siblings now if they didn't. And those are three people I could not imagine my life without, for sure. And my second dad was a saving grace after my dad died, and my mom and I became toxic for each other. I remember always telling myself that that's what he was. I always used to say it from God, but like now it's a different concept. And it was like, I used to say God made sure that I had a second dad when my dad died, because my mom and I became so toxic for each other. He knew I needed someone. And it was very true, very, very true, which is really interesting in retrospect, knowing that we planned the life that we're going to live here and that we're here for a specific reason and the journey that we're on. So anyways, I feel like I'm going off. So I'd like to bring it back a little bit to wherever I was in this part of the story, which was the only part I see in front of me is I chose life for all of us, and I didn't know the cost. However, I was more than happy to pay it if it meant my family and friends would go unharmed, because the abuser held me at gunpoint, and okay, now I remember. Thank you. The subconscious reasoning for why the abuser, the word target comes to mind, but all of this was a soul journey. So we'll use target. Why I was his target was because I was a daddy's girl. I had the inheritance. And the abuser and his dad were
very, very close growing up. And then his dad got into meth and drugs and alcohol and became extremely abusive and abandoned him. And the abuser had this tendency to think that women had it so much easier. And I didn't know it at the time. So, anyways, the subconscious reasoning and pursuing of this whole thing was that the abuser wanted to be me. And since he couldn't be me, the next best thing was to control me. And he did want my inheritance. And I was able to keep that at bay all of those years. I made the goal, my family are thieves. Not every single one of them, but I have thieves in my family. And they stole a lot of my inheritance before I turned 18. However, there was still an in-trust for account with a little bit of money and money that was owed from my dad's business that I could have sued for. And actually one uncle sued the other uncle, so that way I could never sue later on, which it's here nor there. I was never going to sue. It's not a big deal. The abuser wanted me to sue. However, once I found out in even the relationship that I was trapped in now, that because he would verbally tell me that that's why I was there. And so once I understood that and heard it the first time, the goal was from that point on was to keep myself safe and make sure that he never touched my inheritance, which meant allowing my family to steal it, because I would much rather them have it than someone that was doing harm to me the way that the abuser was. So, but long story short, the abuser wanted to be me. And that was a really, really big psychological shock to my system to learn this in psychosis. It made perfect sense though, because that's the story that'll come later. I don't mean to like cliffhanger. However, there's just a lot I want to get through, and so that will come later. How that comes full circle again. Everything's full circle. So I chose life. I didn't want to find out at the end of that gun what he was going to do. And the moment that he threatened my siblings, he had full control over me. I remember the next morning after the fact, waking up and being asked in my head by what I now refer to as spirit, my higher self, what I was going to do. So again, heard these all my life. It's just they came through so seamlessly. There was no clairaudience. There was no different in tones or voices, or that it was something that was like it was from outside of me, like a transmission. However, I didn't, right? Earth was in a quarantine, according to Jessa Reed, who I love. I love that concept because it's like, okay, they can only reach us so much. Or maybe it was just, this is how I activated myself through this lifetime. Was at that time, it wouldn't have served me to know the depths of consciousness and alchemy and hermetics and all of that I know now at that time. I didn't have the conscious capacity for it. I was in trauma. I was in addiction. I was in Stockholm Syndrome. So yeah. Anyways, spirit, my higher self, transmitted that, basically literally the words were, what are you going to do? And I scanned my options. I couldn't turn to my mom, too much shame and toxicity. I didn't trust her enough to help me through this or know what had happened to me. Plus I needed to protect them anyways, right? The abuser just threatened to take them all from me. Or to kill them, not take them from me again. There's that terminology that happened from the trauma when, my dad was taken from me when I was 10. Then I thought of going to the police and canceled that option out as well. The next question I received was, what are you going to choose, love or hate? I scoffed at the question and responded with what do you think I'm going to choose? I'm going to choose love. And I chose love because love was all I ever wanted. And love was what I felt like I lost that day when I lost my dad. And I lost it inside of me too. There was a switch that was flipped, and I entered a completely alternate reality for myself and as well as everyone else around me. There were countless events throughout my early life of conversations like this as well. Oh, I flip-flopped these notes, sorry. So I chose love, and that is what Stockholm Syndrome is when you fall into the belief that you're in love with your abuser to protect yourself. And this changed everything for me. So at this point, back to when I'm in psychosis, that memory and that truth activated a transformation that took place over the next 2 years of breaking the belief cycle of Stockholm Syndrome and that I had loved him and the brainwashing and enmeshment I had survived. It didn't take away the fact that Stockholm Syndrome is real love. Like, that's what I have learned, because I kept looking for a way to disprove or to separate the types of love as I fall in love in real life now. However, it is the same. It is authentic because it's love. And trauma bonds mimic love. Trauma bonds are deeper than love. Trauma bonds are stronger than love, and they're more manipulative and coercive and brainwashing. And so, there was that in there as well. Again, I have a note here. As I have learned through these years, don't battle with spirit, because you will lose when it's not in your soul's best interest. Laugh out loud. One of the other things I do want to get to and mentioned, and probably have failed to do so until now, is Johnny and I were telepathically connected. My knowledge of him was very different than others because of the spiritual nature of our connection. That being said, I was still doing everything I could to connect with him when I ended up homeless again. One of his friends at the time offered for me to come stay with her. However, I was not comfortable with that because, remember, I'm on the verge of homelessness again when I'm dealing with all of these truths coming out, which I'm very thankful for. And also, real quick, backtrack to the mystic psychology. I have always had the gift of being able to see the subconscious motives of people. Like, even though their actions say one thing, I can see usually where it's coming from, even as a child. The first earliest memory I have of it was when I was 12, and it was a traumatic experience, and that might have been what activated it as well. Although, no, it wasn't. Nope, I could see it prior to. Okay, anyways, long story short, so that is one of my blessings and curses, is being able to see the deep hidden truths in people's motives and their actions and where they're actually coming from. And it's a blessing and a curse because it kind of reminds me of the medical medium and his story when, like, he was 4 years old the first time he put his hand to his grandmother's chest and said lung cancer. And it goes on to say that, he would tell people the disease that was in their body whenever he could see it. And of course that's traumatic for people, right? And so now, then he had to learn not. So yeah. So kind of the same thing, except for mine's in the psyche and down in the subconscious. And it all happens through telepathy. That's really, really what it comes through is telepathy. Now that this might expand later on into a deeper understanding. However, right now I will attest it all to telepathy and just how deep I am able to see and how deep I'm willing to go in my own psyche, because I'm willing to go deep every day, every time. So let's see here. I ended up homeless again, and I actually moved back to where I had moved from because that's where my grandmother lived and that's who would take me in. Which was the same county the abuser resided in. Now, during my brief time of sobriety, again, had those memories surface. So it's so hard. I don't want to read a script because it's, however, going through notes, obviously, even intuitively or intellectually, I don't know why that word's coming up. Spirit is organizing these for me, I guess. So just bear with me. Eventually, though, drugs. So this is one of the reasons why I say you got to leave the situation to be able to heal the situation. And you have to stay gone from the situation, and you can't put yourself in another situation and repeat your patterns. Because the moment I started using drugs again, even though I was having these truths, I was still away and had no intention of ever coming in contact with the abuser again. However, the more I used drugs and the more I fought spirit and the more I, tried to get to Johnny at the time, because they were also saying other things to me. One of the biggest things that they continuously said to me over and over again was, I'm making you stronger. I'm making you stronger. I'm making you stronger. And I didn't know whose voice that was coming from. Eventually I found out, and that was from Johnny. And then the other one was, timing is everything. Timing is everything. Timing is everything. And that was for like the first, like this current year of the psychosis, this 2016 into 2017. And then almost all into 2018, really, into like the end of 2017. And the timing was everything. They were screaming at me over and over again about, because I wanted to be with Johnny then. And I wasn't supposed to be. It would have been detrimental to be. And then the I'm making you stronger was something else completely. And then on top of all the other stuff. And then I was also hearing my own family's thoughts and my own family's voices about what they thought about my addiction, what they thought about if I was with Johnny at the time, all of those things. So I was just all firewalls down, right? I always say that the internet is a 3D version of telepathy. Like, no firewalls, you're just seeing everybody's thoughts, everybody's shit, everybody that anybody wants to put out there, and even some that some people don't. There's no like real protection on the internet, right? And being that we're all one, sometimes telepathy is just fucking crazy. That's what it is sometimes from a 3D standpoint. Anyways, we'll hack it together, no worries. So moved back to the county where my grandma was and the abuser was. I ended up being in contact with the abuser when I was desperate for drugs. And one of his like family friends even. And I actually ended up trauma bombing them with how he sexually assaulted me. I was really hung up on the sexual assault. I was trying to process that. I also got shit-faced drunk at a bar one night and ended up, they told me that the cops were sitting in a circle around me, I guess, and I was probably trauma bombing them, and they let me go, and they probably shouldn't have. They probably should have took me to the drunk tank. But that's only because I say that because after that I got beat up outside of another bar. First time for everything in life, right? Not their fault though, it was mine. I was spiteful and hating on someone I'd known for a long time, and I said the wrong thing for the last time. Violence is not something I do well with due to CPTSD. And the violence I sustained repeatedly from the abuser. When I was younger, I was kicked out of school for fighting and previously fought competitively in Taekwondo for years. So I had that egoic mentality that I would accept any challenge because I blatantly did not care about my own life as well. I also thought, you fight with honor. Like, I didn't like people that like sucker punched people or picked up bricks or anything like that. I thought that was dirty, and I lived by this honorary code of fighting, which obviously no one in the drug world does. So anyways, long story short, it didn't matter. The abuse that I suffered definitely knocked the abuse out of like any tendency of my own perpetrating violence, I guess. Life was going further and further downhill for me, and I desperately needed a win. At this point, the abuser did know about Johnny and that I was desperate to get back to the county I felt safe in, as well as be near Johnny. My uncle lives with my grandmother, and my uncle and I started fighting regularly, and so my grandma had to put me up in a hotel, which was a saving grace, right? I was downtown, so I could go to the bars all the time, and I, was able to get somewhat high. Anyways, I ended up meeting a couple at the hotel that had a space for me in their business venture where I earned money driving. I call it a business venture. That's awful. I'm trying to like low-key, like not, be. They had a space for me to drive them back and forth from Detroit. And because I had a valid license. The deal was that I would make money, get high, and eventually make it to 2 different places. Little did I know at the time that the girl was two-timing, and I would very shortly after end up with the truck myself to keep for quite some time. So which means I finally had a way out of that county, and I hit the road immediately. I went back to the county that my dad was from because all of these memories were bringing up things that I wanted to go research, and I needed to go solve this stuff about inheritance and how could I get money. That's what it was like stuck on, right? I was broke, I was homeless, I didn't have anything. So I wanted to turn back to how could I, I was having crazy thoughts about an inheritance that was long gone, and maybe how I could like dig up, I don't know what. I know what, but I don't really want to get into that right now. That's not the purpose of this story. It's just another spiritual crazy experience that we can dig into another day maybe. So I was able to get back to the county eventually that I had moved to and had to leave, and that, more importantly, Johnny was in. So there was, let me look here. There was also something with the psychosis that when I was interacting with others, the abusive voices were much quieter. That's true. Yes. So if I was in, like, if somebody was in my vicinity and I was hanging out with somebody, the voices were quiet. It was when I was alone that they were, that's not always true. Sometimes they would be screaming at me while I'm like 2 feet from somebody having a conversation and trying to have a normal conversation with somebody while I'm getting screamed at in my head. So it was just unpredictable. So I made it back to the county that Johnny lived in, and that's where we're at. Sorry. That there were no signs that he was with Heidi when I arrived at his house for the first time. I also didn't go in. I was so nervous and only spoke with him briefly outside, and then I left. I then developed more courage and turned around to go back. When I got out of the truck, though, I received this message, very vivid. It said, "Be prepared to fight." And of course, I didn't pay any attention to it. I didn't truly comprehend what I was walking into. However, I knocked on the door for the second time, and it swung open to a tiny little female who proceeded to assault me with her saliva and her fists. Needless to say, Johnny had to rip us apart, and I immediately left distraught and angry. It wasn't Heidi, though. I didn't know who she was, and she didn't know me either. Being back in the town that had become home to me, I found out soon enough what all I'd missed. Johnny and the circle of individuals we knew and hung out with together had fallen apart after what happened with me, and I already told you guys about the falling out, Heidi living with me, which I was somewhat aware of. I just didn't know what had taken place in Johnny's life since then, since I'd become homeless and left. We'd only messaged each other a few times. It was very short, very brief, that kind of stuff. So Johnny and the circle of individuals we knew and hung out with had falling out. And again, I was trauma bombing people. That did not stop, okay? Trauma bombing, psychosis didn't stop through this specific time period. I found that Johnny had been still busy climbing the ladder, and we all know the higher the climb, the steeper the fall. I found out that Johnny now directly surrounded himself with all of this girl's friends, and we're going to call her Katerina, Kat for short, granting her a large amount of control over his life. I heard all of the ways she was robbing him and scheming behind his back. Johnny was in no healthy condition or mind frame either. None of us really were. We were all using meth, and some were using other drugs along with it. I also found out that Kat and Johnny were highly volatile and abusive together. I also found out why, and I will go ahead and let you know that Kat herself, which we are not in touch with, has also found her way to freedom and out of the life she knew and was raised in that was so prone to violence being the only expression one knew how to communicate with. Katerina has now found happy, joyous freedom, and for that, I'm thankful for. I don't care who you are, even the abuser. The only words that I ever said to him after I was granted the lifetime protective order, when I ran into him at Walmart in the county that I now live in, which was terrifying, and I will save that for another day, was, I hope you find a 12-step program, some type of freedom. It doesn't have to be 12-step. It can be any type of recovery. It doesn't matter. Just fix yourself. Heal yourself. So, sorting out my thoughts here. because it starts to get a little bit more complicated because so much went on and I'm only trying to hone in on specific aspects. I was trying to reach Johnny. However, Kat and I ended up fighting twice. The first I previously mentioned, and the second one she maced me. No matter though, I did what I could to be there for Johnny, knowing he was in a horrible situation. After my stint living with an abuser myself, let's just say the abuser definitely abused any tendency I had towards violence right out of me, and I knew it too. With CPTSD rearing its ugly head, it was hard for me to do much more than freeze, even when I thought I was ready. I'd gone 15 years without fighting, and only a few without being abused. While I wanted to be strong and brave in the sense of a fighter like I had been in my teen years, trauma had consumed me, and I had no clue. I eventually ran out of funds and drugs, and the only option was to sell the truck. However, it wasn't mine, so technically, I couldn't. Losing the truck grounded me further into Kat and Johnny's world. While I wasn't able to reach Johnny, I was continuously introduced to many of the people Kat knew and brought around. Because Johnny introduced me to one of his old friends that interacted with all of them, I still had a connection, as well as Johnny's like closest friend, best friend that I knew when I first met Johnny, was still around. Him and Johnny had a falling out. However, I was still able to get in touch with him and therefore get dope and get high and get rides and things like that. I lost the truck ultimately because the longtime friend that I didn't know that Johnny introduced me to ended up shooting the truck's engine up. So that was an experience for sure with me in it. And that was because this person was calling Johnny a snitch, and I didn't care either way, whether he was or not. I knew that he wasn't because Johnny was the big fish in the pond and everyone knew it. And I was defending Johnny. And everybody kind of got sick of me defending Johnny because that's what I did, right? I was so infatuated with him that all I did was defend him. And that was because from what I knew and what I saw firsthand, not even what the prophecy of the oracle told me, was that everybody was trying to harm him. And they wanted his spot. They wanted what he had. They wanted, all of that stuff. And so the truck got shut up, and eventually it was towed to a park and ride where then it sat forever, and the police ended up like impounding it and sending it somewhere, and I lost all of my belongings. So once I was on foot again, I was more reliant on these people that I hardly knew and that were mostly related to Kat. And I bounced around between hotel rooms, whether it be my own or others on nights that I didn't have my own, and I met other people. And one of them just happened to be somebody that we'll call Daniel, and they called themselves Johnny's best friend now, because Noel and Johnny had the falling out, the closest friend that I knew when I first met Johnny. And the one that shot the truck up, we'll just call Mullet. We'll just call him Mullet. So Noel and I continued to stay in contact. Mullet and I obviously not. And so I ended up being around this Daniel guy, and Daniel was weird and made me very uncomfortable. He tried to be nice. However, it was this like snake nice. And I love snakes. Don't get me wrong. I love the shedding of the skin and all that stuff. But this was like that, like, deceitful, manipulative. I even have a snake. His name's Chariot, and he's a banana ball python, and he's lovely. I just love him so much. Anyways, so Daniel was just weird, and he always talked shit about Johnny. They all did. There was nobody that didn't talk shit about Johnny. They all talked shit about Johnny, and they praised Kat like she was a queen. And I have a note here that says, "This is the drug life, just reminiscing for a moment at how awful it was. No real friends, no honest words, manipulative intentions, and so on. I certainly don't miss it." So as I hotel hopped and met these people, I trauma bombed them as well with what I remembered the abuser doing when I was 18. I didn't think anything about it. This memory was just pouring out of me like a bleeding wound that there was no current bandage for. Daniel was Johnny's right-hand man, though, and obviously in love with Kat. I wondered, of course, if Johnny knew or if he even cared. It didn't take long for Kat to get wind of my constant defense of Johnny, and I can't even say how it happened. I do, however, remember Daniel having everyone come to a hotel room, and I mean like a large amount of people that I really didn't know. Some knew Johnny, and some, but the majority, like, it was destruction, is what this whole time period was. It was just destruction, the universe destroying and imploding. I do, like I said, they all came to the hotel room and they started like messing with me because I couldn't be deterred or manipulated. I actually ended up locking everyone out of the room that Daniel paid for and wasn't going to let anyone in until I felt safe. The one friend that Johnny and I knew together, Noel, showed up to talk to me, and I did eventually let Noel in. All of my clothes were stolen that night, as the little bit that I was able to carry with me and had, because they were in the laundry room at the hotel. And I remember finally coming out of the room to the parking lot with Noel, and a lot more people had gathered. Noel and I were talking in the parking lot whenever a handful more vehicles pulled in. And I even recognized one as Heidi's cousin. I don't know if he recognized me or not. It doesn't matter. They all proceeded to make a circle around me. Some had brought baseball bats. I remember Noel telling me to get in his truck, and I wouldn't. I said I didn't care about any of these people circling me. The 30 or so of them could literally go screw themselves because I hadn't done a damn thing to any of them, and whatever their deal was with me was ultimately their deal with Johnny, because those that had contact with, that had contact with raved about Kat and put Johnny down consistently because they'd known her for years. They were from her town and her crew and connects she had made. And to be fair, they all had a grudge against Johnny. And I know that sounds like really like cliche. Oh, like, how is Johnny so perfect and Kat like not? And it's like, no, Johnny was not perfect. He was an asshole. He was deep into addiction. He was mean. Not to me, but I can accept that that's how he was to other people. And but Kat brought out the worst in him. And maybe he brought out the worst in her. I don't know. But from my understanding, she was always that abusive. And that's what she shared with Johnny's daughter at the time, even. So I'm not going off of, I'm going off of patterns and lifestyles and history. That's here nor there. No, that's probably a weird tangent. So I stood in the center of that circle and just stood there and looked at all of them. And eventually they all dispersed. The bikers got on their bikes and drove off. The people in the backs of trucks with the baseball bats left. It was all really awkward, I'm sure. I had no idea what I was going to do. I definitely didn't feel welcome, but I also had nowhere to go. I also don't remember what happened directly after that. I do know I made it out alive and was just fine and nobody touched me. Noel left because I wouldn't get in the truck with him. And I think I just ended up walking to another hotel and getting a hotel room, calling like my dad or my grandma or something. So eventually I got in contact with Noel again. And I still had a little bit of contact with Daniel. I was desperate, right? To stay high, to stay in contact with Johnny. And so like I stayed in contact with these people so I could somehow be connected to Johnny. And it became more and more obvious that Daniel had a lot of other things going on. He would drop little bits and pieces of, well, somebody wore a wire Wednesday night. And it's like, what are you talking about? Like, you know what I mean? Like, and it would just be like a little drop. And I met a lot of people, like I said, that were associated with Kat, trauma bombing all of them. And then I met somebody at Knowles. And his name, we'll call him Froggy. I love some of these nicknames. It's funny. And some of them are very, like, it's just funny. Never mind. So Froggy. So Froggy and I kind of hit it off. He didn't make me feel weird like a lot of the other males that I'd been around made me feel. Like everybody was all into like trading sex for dope and I was not. And so it's just, I didn't have, like, Froggy never made me feel that way. And I was grateful for that. Froggy was interested in someone else and in love with someone else. And so I thankfully had a reprieve. Again, trauma bond Froggy. And I was comfortable enough to actually go to Froggy's house. And it was a very confusing experience. I remember standing at Froggy's kitchen sink looking out the window and remembering that I had seen that scene before. It wasn't a premonition though. I couldn't remember where I had seen it. I also recognized all the pictures of his family on the walls in the living room. I was so confused. I kept telling Froggy, I know these people. Like, I know them, and I don't know how I know them. Oh my gosh, I know every single one of them. Like, it's crazy. Not every single one, but the majority of them. There was like 80% that I remember. I couldn't remember how I knew them. I just knew I knew them. I thought maybe even that they were pictures of Johnny's family. However, I didn't know Johnny's family to even know that. So it was like, no, that definitely can't be it. So psychosis, CPTSD, and telepathy all did very strange things to me as it was. So while I still tried really hard to remember, I couldn't. I even came to a conclusion well, maybe Froggy was related to me, and maybe those were some of my family members that how else? I couldn't comprehend it. So within those couple days I ended up shoplifting and getting caught, somewhat shoplifting. Gotta take responsibility for it, right? It's like one of those things. I didn't shoplift, but I did shoplift again, right? We're in another paradox. I know that's weird. However, it's how it happened. I had the cart and unloaded everything at the register, and then I forgot I had a bag on my shoulder when I asked to go outside and get the money to pay for the items. The cashier said yes. I started to walk out. They pinned me for shoplifting. Rightfully so, though, because we were there to do that. However, I was really just going to get the hell out of there because we knew we were being watched. So they busted me, rightfully so. Again, didn't shoplift, but got busted for it because I was, whatever. Full circle. Froggy eventually came back and got me, and it wasn't long after that I stopped hanging out with him in the group that we were hanging out with. It was never really just me and Froggy, and those other individuals are part of different parts of other stories that split off. Some are really shitty, and one I can say is part of one of the shittiest and most horrific experiences I've experienced while on this path. However, it really serves no purpose here, so we're going to move right along. Noel picked me back up and was kind enough to pay for a couple of nights at a motel. The next day, Noel was over when Daniel called him and told him that Johnny had been busted and there were helicopters and feds everywhere at Johnny's house. The next week was hell as I tried to get out to Johnny's to save his stuff. Kat was arrested as well. She was picked up on a K-piss, and I was stuck in a hotel going crazy as I knew every one of them were out there stealing all of Johnny's stuff, lying to me and doing a lot of, dick things, I guess. Everyone filtered off. They had no reason to contact me anymore, or I them. I was broke with nothing. I don't know if it was in that contemplation or if it was just a point of activation. However, as my last week in a hotel dwindled near, I prepared myself to hit the streets again. Somewhere in this time-space continuum, it hit me though. All of the knowledge and understanding poured right in, like my higher self opening the floodgates. The pictures I saw on the wall at Froggy's were of Froggy's family. And the people that filled those pictures were the abuser when he was a child. And all of the abuser's family that I had met all of the years that I had been trapped in that relationship. There were also female cousins that were pictured on the wall that Daniel had brought around and that I had trauma bombed with what the abuser had done to me. It all came full circle. Full freaking circle. I feel so blessed in this moment. I had been telling all of the abuser's family members what he did to me, and I didn't even know it. I could see now that once I mentioned the abuser's names, how things shifted. And one of the girls was sitting in my hotel room. Her Jeep had broke down, and she was hanging out with me while the guys looked at it because she just happened to be at another room. And I told her the story, and as soon as they said that, her ride was there, which was shortly after, she jumped up and she was like, I'll be back in a little bit, and she never came back. In some of the scariest and terrifying years of my life, in the depths of this psychosis and drug addiction, I got my karmic justice. And then I realized the biggest part of all. That Kat and the abuser that had held me captive and abused me for 10 years had grown up and been raised together. Just going to sit with that for a second. My twin flame and I, who lived across the states most of our lives, and I escaped and left and moved to get away from the abuser that I knew, ended up with a female abuser. My twin flame did. Ended up with the female abuser from pretty much the same family. They're not related by blood. However, they were raised together. Same county even. It's interesting because there's 3 counties in West Virginia involved. One the abuser and I lived in. The middle one is the one that the abuser and Kat are from. And then the other one Johnny lived in and that I moved to. And so it was like this ethereal bridge that my twin flame and I had to go through to find each other were these 2 abusers that knew each other and been raised together, and their parents knew each other, and their families knew each other, and they were family to each other. However, because the abuser's dad had like the drug addiction or whatever, like the abuser didn't really go back to that county anymore. So these family members he had all grown up with. However, in the late teens and 20s years of ages, they didn't really have contact anymore. They didn't see each other. There were some of them that lived in the county that the abuser and I lived in. And they were the ones that I could recognize on the wall even better. Like I had holidays with them and knew them, and they were children. They were more recent pictures of like little girls and stuff like that. So yeah, I had no way to reach Johnny to tell him this. He was now on his way to prison, and Kat and Daniel ended up moving into Johnny's house together, and Kat got pregnant and told Johnny it was his. Eventually their lies and lives fell apart too, and they destroyed and trashed Johnny's house. Daniel claiming that if he couldn't have it, Johnny would never have it or enjoy it again. It turns out that 17 people signed statements on Johnny and 3 wore wires. Daniel's family was even part of the police force. Daniel and Kat had been the 2 from the article that would set Johnny up. However, Johnny had also made his own bed to sleep in. Some people have to ruin their lives and run it into the ground as far as they possibly can before they can save themselves. I could see Johnny was one of those. As for the oracle, it was no doubtedly right. I just didn't know Kat and Daniel existed at the time of the prophecy being revealed to me. Therefore, they could only communicate to me in ways that I could comprehend. Kat and Heidi were very similar in personality, and Daniel and the abuser were as well. Kat would have never believed, or Daniel, that I just wanted Johnny and didn't care about the drugs. Neither of them knew me. However, I was a huge problem for both of them when I started coming back around. And to tie in that the abuser was part of the family that Kat was a part of, and that were defending her and enabling her and all of those things. Johnny was sentenced to 9 years. I got clean. Johnny got clean. We reconnected after he saw Kat for who she was at the time. I worked on myself and lived in psychosis for 5 years total. Joe worked on himself and took rehabilitation and recovery classes in prison. I didn't know what was going to happen between us. Recovery had taught me to let him go, and if it was meant to be, it would come back to me. The love I knew for Johnny was unhealthy and extremely codependent. I was toxic, and so was that love. Johnny mirrored every behavior back to me, and I him. We healed simultaneously. There's a whole other chapter with the psychosis and him being in prison. However, I think this is enough for today. I can say that I got healthier with each passing year. That year that Johnny got arrested, I had 4 suicide attempts because of the voices in Psychosis. This was before and after his arrest. The last one was after he was arrested. It took me another year to quit self-harming and drinking because of the flashbacks and voices. By the next year, I was only breaking down every day, dying to be committed so I could just give up. I strategically worked with a counselor and therapists, the 12-step programs, and prolonged exposure took me from a 58 to a 16 on the CPTSD scale, and it started to give me my life back. The 12 steps gave me the rest of it back. So did the psychosis and the spirits and my higher self. All of the premonitions came true and still continue to when I have them. I now know a massive amount about telepathy and how to use it. I also don't know that much about it and don't know how to use it, which is, of course, another paradox in itself. I also have an abundance of other skills and gifts that I have activated on my journey. I'll save all of that for the next chapter, though, because that's when they really started to be developed and the more magic was starting to happen. Until then, happy full solar eclipse, and may it ever be transforming and activating for you. And happy birthday to me today. This recording is a gift to myself, a gift of unconditional love, that I may no longer fear putting myself out here and what I have experienced. Until next time, I go by Toria, and I host Hermetically Speaking. Thanks for listening.